Hello, it's Wednesday, 7:30. DebateSensei here talking about the national topic for public forum. I am Jared Kubika Miller, communications professor and debate coach, and we have Tim Seavey, assistant to the director of forensic at San Diego State University. How are we doing?
It's going.
All right. So it is just the two of us. Matt is out filing an application for a food truck. He's going to call it Shap's Wraps. It is a paleo-friendly menu. All right, look for it.
Wishing him luck.
All right. So today we're going to talk about the public forum topic. I mean, I really do like applying what we're looking at and trying to have a discussion about what affects students right now. I'm glad we're able to do it. So here, let me just put it up here so everyone can take a look, right? On balance, charter schools are beneficial to the quality of education in the United States. So what we were going to do is we talk a lot about the affirmative. We talk a lot about, making a case for something and how do you do that. And so I wanted to switch it up and go pretty much negative this time, and Tim and I have gone and did just a bit of research, just maybe like 30 minutes, maybe an hour's worth of research, and developed the outlines of a strategy. All right, collected a few articles, and we're going to compare them right now. But I'm going to throw a curveball to Tim right now. How about, since Shap isn't here, we do a little segment on resolutional analysis, but like from a negative point of view.
Sure. So
yeah.
I think there's a common issue with resolutional analysis from the neg that you have to go exact opposite to whatever it is.
Right.
And that is pinning you into a hole way too small. You can do so much more with negative. And I think those are cool light bulb moments for debaters. Like when they get that aha of, oh, negative can be as creative as you want. You can go in lots of directions with it. It's just not the affirmative. With public forum, it's a little bit more evenly cut. Like the negative side generally does have a burden to be a little bit more traditionally like, the opposite, but you still don't have to go fully that way. So for this one, I think one of the most key terms that come from it is the quality of education. So I think that's going to be the kind of sticking point of how you go about defining the quality of education, and not getting into like, well, charter schools, make for better workers, or charter schools, misuse their facilities, or whatever it happens to be. If it doesn't come back to the quality of education, I think that's like the central value of the round. I think you still have a lot of ground to win. So being focused in your negative arguments, I think, is a key one, at least particularly with this topic.
When I put together criteria, now, like in my old age, I think how the wording of it really, really helps. So in this situation, I would lay down the gauntlet and say that they have to prove that that the quality of education is better now than it was 20 years ago. Let's say 20 years ago, right? It's like, because charter schools have been going up in number and as many students, student populations and things like that. And so you have to provide like some pretty definitive proof, and absent that, you lose.
Sure.
And I think that's a pretty good challenge to put down. It's fair too. It really, I do think that it's fair. It's not like you can't refute it, but I think it's fair to say, like, listen, charter schools have only been increasing. It's like, we should be seeing some sort of data by now. There should be enough history behind this that you can provide absolute stuff. You know what I mean?
Right.
And hopefully, affirmatives are up to that challenge.
Right. And that's, I think that's a useful one that maybe is a missed opportunity for some negative teams, is the onus to define the framework, to set up a criteria for what it, how the round should be weighed. I think that oftentimes that's just easily conceded. Like the neg just says like, well, whatever the affirmative says. But I know as an affirmative public forum debater, I would regularly set up frameworks that were a little skewed in my direction. So I think that's a point that should not be ignored and should definitely be taken by the neg side.
Yeah, each side has an interest, and like as long as they both, fulfill their own interest, the interest of the affirmative is to point out where the words in the resolution that don't come with any burdens, or you say it's not my burden to say this, it's not my burden to say that.
Right.
The negative is the exact opposite. They say, okay, it is their burden to say this, though, and so if they don't provide that in the very first speech in public forum, I think that you kind of like, all right, I had this prepared, I was listening for it, didn't hear it. I think that they have not just met presumption. I just think I think they've not met their burden of proof, even without any evidence from my side.
Sure.
Yeah.
Cool. So let's get into it.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. So, hey, go ahead. Like, tell me what sort of you found and what's the story. At least one story, right? This isn't the only one. This is one that could put forward.
Yeah, so I've got to say, I was pretty ignorant to charter schools as a whole, so I'm glad to have researched this. And I think I found a lot of awesome stuff that I didn't previously know. So I think those that are on the negative side have a little bit of an uphill battle, but I think there's a few areas that are fairly big holes to exploit. So the first one comes from an article in Forbes that was talking about how charter schools are not public. Yes, they are given public monies. Yes, they have to be approved by a generally public charter organization, and to some extent re-audited and meet that charter on a regular basis. However, they are in the end still private companies. So the National Labor Relations Board also conferred this. There's a final ruling that came down saying that charter schools are private businesses. End of discussion. And when they are, like, they can be nonprofit organizations, but they are still private businesses. I think that's an important distinction to make. That would probably be a good idea to define for teams here. So where that becomes a problem is in the interest of auditing. So according to that same Forbes article, there is no Freedom of Information Act access into the ways that charter schools spend their funds. So while they receive public money, the public cannot look into how they spend that money. So there was actually an audit, I believe it was in the case of Ohio, where the auditing organization wanted to see, dollar by dollar where everything was spent, and the school wouldn't allow it. It ended up going to the state Supreme Court, and the charter school won, saying that, their books are protected and not accessible via Freedom of Information Act or otherwise. So that lack of transparency becomes a big problem. Now that doesn't prove anything yet, but that opens a big door that I think the negative team can run with. So
yeah, I think there's what I would highly recommend a John Oliver piece on charter schools as well. Oh, I'm pulling it up here. So let me post that. So we're posting all the stuff that we found in comments as well. I actually think that it's a good idea to have a little sort of pop culture reference to the discussion, right? I think it makes it, like there's certain language choices that pop up that you might want to take on that are really helpful. And like the stuff I found when we get to my set, but John Oliver, his show does like these really thoroughly researched pieces of news, much deeper than you get in like traditional media sources, and then he adds humor on top of it. So that's the thing. So one of the parts was talking about how even if there are transparency laws in certain areas, that they can contract out to private companies. So you could be a charter school and that you get public money and you have to explain how you use that public money. But if you use that public money to pay a learning management coordinator or, some sort of director or something like that, I forget what some of the names were, but they don't have to disclose anything because they're private contractors, right? And so you're just funneling money. A lot of times the people who are, well, not a lot of times, but there are cases where the person who's running the charter school is also the person running the learning management, private contract business. Yeah. Right.
And there was actually a court case about that related to coronavirus stuff. So Concordia University, not the one in Irvine, it's actually one up in Oregon, was sued amidst all of its COVID switchover. And it was because one of the, I think it was like the director of the school or like one of the administrators of the school also owned an online learning platform, and they like really quickly and seamlessly switched over to this online platform that seemed like it was a good response, but I think it was all kinds of like money funneling. So there was a case between, you know, the citizens and the school. Now that's at the collegiate level, it gets a little bit more difficult. But one of the things you said a moment ago, I wanted to point out, in that when they receive public monies, I would assume they still have to, report where that goes. In the broadest sense, yes, a charter school can still lose its charter if it mismanages or miscalculates funds. However, in some cases, they don't have to report anything specific. And one of I think the biggest areas, and this is where it becomes not just an argument to ignorance, not a logical fallacy of we don't know, therefore it's bad, but an actual unique data point of where it is bad, is teacher pay. So in that same school where the audit was determined by the Supreme Court as unjust and the charter school got to keep all their books private, teachers were not even able to access their own pay scale. They were not even allowed to know what their pay scale was at an individual basis. Public schools in most places will make it, freely accessible to all citizens to see what teachers are paid, what their salaries are.
Hey, so what's in this Harvard article that you caught?
Yeah, so the Harvard article is, I think, what provides the more hard evidence to why it's actually harmful to education overall. So it says that charter schools lose 24% of their teachers annually, and that's actually double the rate of traditional schools. So this high turnover rate is a major issue and one of the key sticking points. And the primary reason for that is longer hours and worse pay. Also, generally like worse benefits as well. So I think when you get this intersection between a lack of transparency of where the funds go, and then just this, glaring issue of lower pay and longer hours for teachers, it seems like the financial brunt of it ends up getting placed onto the teacher's back. And I think you can make a very strong argument for the direct causal link between teacher pay, teacher appreciation, teacher, longevity, and the quality of education. Like those two things are too inextricably linked. So when these corporations don't have to report where their money comes from or where their money goes, and it's already known that teachers are paid, far less and double the turnover rate, I think that right there is the key point of the case. That would be the narrative that I make, being in support of teachers and how charter schools mistreat them. I'm sure it's not the case everywhere, but I think that that's the biggest avenue that I think you could make a pretty compelling case. Also, because a lot of your judges are teachers, they've got that sympathetic vibe.
That's a good observation. I mean, the little audience analysis probably goes a long way with that. All right, cool. Right.
So I'm sure we can pick it apart a whole bunch, but I want to hear yours.
Yeah. Okay, so first thing I'm going to share is this 2009 article from Education Week. Right. And this article is kind of lays the sort of groundwork for charter schools leading to racial segregation. So, the evidence for charter schools back then was not too robust, but there was still like a sort of prediction that this would be the case. But it just kind of provides a beginning point. What I thought was a big, just a bomb piece of evidence is this Duke Law Journal article from the Duke Journal of Constitutional Law and Public Policy. And this thing is free. Like I got it through my database at my college, but I looked online and it's free. And you go to that link right there, and anybody can get it. This is such a phenomenal piece of evidence because first off, it's 2019. All right. This is very recent stuff. And it has very recent data, but it also goes through the entire history of charter schools and how it has led to what they call white charter school enclaves. All right. Okay. And so where there are areas in neighborhoods that are, predominantly people of color or underprivileged. And when a charter school pops up in there, that it attracts, more affluent people than the surrounding area. And then the last thing I'm going to share with you, just to kind of like complete the story, and then we'll kind of talk about it, is an article from LAist from a very recent example that I became familiar with. Right in our backyard, Orange County School of the Arts had this standoff with Santa Ana, and the problem was that they had these sort of qualifications to get into the School of the Arts. They had to audition, but the people who were auditioning had the resources and means to get high levels of training, and really sort of like pad their ability to get in. And so it was like they were taking in like interstate and international students, but before they were taking people in the neighborhood, right, for that. And so the reason I kind of like this strategy is, first off, like you lay the groundwork that said segregation is bad for education, right? There's just a whole lot of evidence for that. And so I didn't get that evidence, but that's the next step, is like, why is segregation bad for education? It's easy to find. But then you can, and this is the syllogistic reasoning, right? Segregation bad for education. Charter schools are segregated. They promote segregation. Okay, and so that Duke article does like the entire breakdown of it, and the Santa Ana example kind of like really puts it into color for you. And so I thought that'd be good, because even if they're pointing out like the OSHA's success, you're saying, yeah, well, that's because they're picking and choosing, what I mean, where public schools don't. So you're not, and so that's when it goes back to the criteria where you say, okay, it has to be better for all education in the United States, not just for a select few people, right? You know what I mean? It's like, and so you have to prove that charter schools are benefiting the education beyond just their students, everybody's education, you know what I mean? And so,
yeah, I didn't consider that. That's true, because just because you've got, a bunch of great examples of like, look at these wonderful things charter schools have done, if that comes at the expense of any other student's education, that's true. Like, that should also lose.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think that's a really good turn. I think that's a good frontline strategy that negative teams should have, preset to go as a response. Like, okay, we recognize, look at all these great things that, some of your students have done. What about the people that didn't get into that school? Or what about the folks that were excluded from that?
Right. I mean, the ability to fall back on that argument, I think, is really strategic for a debate. You backs them into a corner saying, well, there's nothing wrong with segregation, and you're like, I got, it's pretty easy to find the evidence on why it is, and so and it's been continuing, but under sort of different methods, right? And so, like, charter schools, there are some really good lines in that article. I wasn't able to get through all of it. Like I said, I mean, it's like you don't have to kind of like start getting the story. That's the important part, is that you start seeing these parts, and you realize that they go together, and you can tell a much larger story than just even the journal article can. I mean, the journal article is pretty damn good, but yeah.
So one point I think that your strategy, so like we can kind of evaluate here, one of the things I think would be a common response, or things that I've seen in debate, particularly coming out of like affirmative action debates, when you're discussing, segregation, polarization in schools and access and what's better for education, what's worse. I don't think anyone will disagree with you that segregation in schools is bad. Like, that's very straightforward. I think the ways that other teams will say, like, well, it's not segregation, it's a meritocracy. You have to be, apply to get in. No matter how many dollars you have, if you're good enough, you can get in. And I think therein lies this differentiation between like de facto discrimination and de jure discrimination, right? So like de facto discrimination is just like, well, by nature of all this, the average or almost every student being from another area, from a more affluent background, having all this greater access, that is not directly saying you are, of this background, you can't get in, but it has the same end result.
Yeah.
And that's a trickier one to get around, because then how do you argue for really selective schools?
Yeah. Oh, it looks like you're freezing up there. That is response that you have to go for. I mean, you have to go for that it doesn't link, but that does push your opposition into the realm of having to find actual evidence that it doesn't create this. Now, perhaps that evidence is out there. Perhaps it is, and I haven't come across it yet. Remember, we're focusing on the negative right now. That's too bad, Tim. We're only focusing on the negative right now, but I think that you can start seeing how a bit of resolutional analysis and a bit of these different strategies can start telling a much larger story. Notice how the criteria that I start coming up with that I would apply in the very beginning of my speech, if I was on the negative, the very first thing I'd be talking about is particular burdens that I think that my opposition, the affirmative team, the burdens that they have. Cool. We got Tim back. How you doing, man?
Hey, sorry about that. So the point that I was just saying was the difference between de facto and de jure discrimination. So de jure discrimination is like there is explicitly a policy that says you can't have X, Y, or Z people as part of the school. But meanwhile, de facto is it just happens that way anyways. So when you're discussing of whether something is discrimination or whether it's just a meritocracy, I think that gets tricky. So I wonder how strategically you would maybe navigate through that, right? So like Harvard or some really elite selective institution will probably have a substantial skew towards those folks that have all kinds of students that have all kinds of access to special tutors and outside extracurriculars and events and opportunities and stuff that don't apply elsewhere. So without affirmative action or some other like mechanism of balancing, how do you go about solving those schools that are, air quotes, meritocracies, but then end up becoming discriminatory? Like, how does one solve that?
Right. What I was just talking about was returning, like using a criteria to fall back on that. And that's why like there's certain burdens that come up where you say, listen, you have to show that something has actually changed. All right. If the only thing that has changed is the way that we justify segregation, then that hasn't improved the quality of education, right? It's kind of like even if I say, well, that's a clever way of, it's like you have to actually provide data that something has changed. And not only that, but changed for the better, that we have better education now overall, just hands down now overall than we did 20 years ago. If you can do that, you win. And I don't think you could do that. I don't think so. And so I mean, just like really lay down the law, just really I mean, like I love those numerical things, I mean, it's like where I'm like, all right, I give you 20 years. All right. It's like year 2000. How was education in America then? And how's it stack up now? I mean, I'd be looking up those international test scores and see what direction have we gone the United States in the last 20 years.
I think that's going to be a really common one, is even just the debate on both sides over what counts as better. Is it a higher graduation rate? Is it greater literacy? Yeah. Is it admission to college? I think that one is such a BS metric, right? Of like, matriculation to college, to 4-year universities. Like, how the hell does that correlate to a higher quality education? Like, I think there's a lot of really good front lines and response you could have about whatever mechanism the other side uses if they go for stuff like that. So, or if it's like, average pay post school, maybe that's more, if we want to just like straight make it capitalist, like a better education because you make more money after or something like that. Like, I think it's really tricky to come up with a fair level, because even if you said like graduation rates, like that depends on how rigorous the school is, right? Like in some schools you may not graduate and others that you may. So I think graduation rate may be one of the fairer standards. I think literacy or something, those are like very low standards, but they're still there. I don't know. What do you think? Like maybe something like Common Core? Like what's a fair bar to be able to say education is better if it does this? Because I think it's a fair burden, but I think you have to define, like you have to either give an option of what is a fair burden or like meet it yourself in your own case if you're going to define something like that.
Yeah, I mean, like the only metrics I know are like test scores. You know what I mean?
Sure.
But yeah, I do, but I do like the concept a bit more about um, work or some sort of self supporting ability, or I love that a lot more, the ability to just sort of support yourself,
Sure.
which and so how would you measure that,
I think I would say, like, if you can find these numbers, maybe they exist in national education databases or whatnot. But I would probably tie it to avoiding worst case scenarios, right? So, like, take the number of schools that went through private or through public school. What percentage of those students after schooling were in poverty, right, or something like that? Granted, it's still like boiling it down to just a financial metric, but you got to work with something. So I would say, how many of them upon grad or like X years after graduation or something like that live below the poverty line, and how many live above the poverty line. Now that's going to be still pretty skewed to
yeah
where you started, but
I
if we use this common thing in debate, like education is the only way to break the cycle of poverty. If you can
Mhm.
show that charter schools have gotten more students out of poverty, that's a pretty kick-ass stat, right? Like, if you can break
That's
the cycle of
interesting.
poverty through a
Yeah.
school, that's epic.
Yeah, if on the negative, I'd be definitely researching, like, because I do know that poverty levels have been going down in general, and so I
Sure.
would be, I wouldn't be surprised at all if there's less, poverty now than there was 20 years ago.
Sure.
Interesting way to
If you
do
can, if
that.
you can tie those
Uh,
things together, that's going to be key. And I think that will probably be missed a decent amount. Like, people may miss the actual correlation between charter or public school. Like, they may say, like, well, more students been going to charter schools and poverty's been going down, therefore A equals B. And that's not a fair comparison. But I think it's still possible, if you can find any stats related to it. Like, that's just one avenue that I would probably go towards, because like meaningful employment may be another one. So like the National Bureau of Labor Statistics does have a definition between employed and underemployed. So you could maybe go for that, of like what percentage of students seek full or reach full employment versus underemployment versus unemployment. So you could maybe tie those things together. Like, it's still a pretty utilitarian way of measuring education, but I think if you got to come up with something, that's maybe one of the better ones.
yeah, I mean, there's reading levels and math levels and
Sure.
stuff like that. I mean, like, those are pretty good. They're not necessarily just scores. They're kind of
Sure.
scores. I mean, but like,
They have
um,
to come from standardized tests still, but it's
yeah,
still something.
but the thing is, like, if we have more people, I don't know, completing of physics courses in high school, in 2020 than we did 20 years ago, even if they have lower grades, I'm like, oh, maybe that is an indication our
Sure.
education, like, we're actually pushing for higher levels, and that's why we're struggling, is because we're constantly pushing that, to I don't know, if students are learning more. I know that there's way more computer science classes out there, you know
Sure.
what I mean? It's like, than I ever took. And so if they're learning more, maybe their test scores aren't a reflection of necessarily that. You know what I mean? It's kind of like, holy
Sure.
crap, we're expecting a whole lot more out of people as well.
Right. Yeah. I think maybe some very straightforward standards to avoid would be things like SAT scores. I think
Yeah.
College Board, as a corporation, a for-profit corporation, does a lot. I think they're for-profit. They do a lot to correlate SAT scores with X, Y, and Z, so that like students will go do those things that correlate to, or that have some tie or SAT scores. But I think that would be a terrible metric. And I think on either
Yeah.
side of the debate, I would strongly urge to throw that out as any correlative between these charter school students did way better on the SAT. Like, well, the SAT has nothing to do with quality of education.
Yeah.
It's written by people that are not educators, and it's even being tossed out. Like, I think a lot of the Ivy League doesn't even accept SAT scores now,
Yeah. Yeah.
which is like, I think that's pretty cool to see. So I would find statistics about maybe like quality of life or something like that. And if you can't directly correlate quality of life of where you went to school, at least take some of those pieces that factor into quality of life, and start seeing what you can correlate with charter versus public education.
All right. Well, it was a good discussion about charter schools. Remember, we were just focusing on the negative side this time. That does not mean that this is our personal beliefs on the subject. We're just kind of like, strategizing and things like that. I'm Jared Kubika Miller, debate coach, communications professor. This is Tim Seavey, Visual and Assistant Director for San Diego State University. We will see you next week, everybody. I'm going to get this right this time, okay? All right. See ya.
See ya.